Hello Year 9, welcome to the week beginning the 15th of June. Miss Douglas here. I wanted to go through with an audio recording in the background now just to go through the task for this week. So this week you're going to start by reading the summary again, especially Act 3 on slide 4. You're going to complete the quiz on Act 3 with the link attached to Kahoot. You're going to look at the timeline on slide 5 in relation to context. You're going to then watch the video on context and continue to fill in the same grid on slide 6. And then finally you're going to answer the question on slide 7. So, Act 1, you've got the link to the film there, please, if you haven't watched it already. I'd like you to make sure that you have at least watched that so you remember the story of the play itself. But in Act 1, obviously, you've got Priestley giving detailed instructions on how the play should be staged. Remember, it is a play, it is to be performed. So therefore, he does give instructions, Priestley, from the beginning as to what it should look like on stage. It takes place in a single room, the dining room of the Burlings, and there are obviously small adjustments, okay, throughout the staging of the performance. The stage directions do specify that the house isn't cosy and home-like, and that the lighting needs to become brighter and harder when the inspector arrives. So that's something quite important to remember, because that is all about the staging and the way that the tension is building, and then the way that the scene changes as the play opens. The first act opens with the Burlings and Gerald Croft celebrating the engagement of Sheila and Gerald. Obviously, it then goes on that they're talking about future, and Mr. Burling makes a speech that he is happy that Sheila's marrying Gerald because Gerald's parents are very wealthy. It's a very good time, he says, but obviously the audience of 1945 would pick up on the fact that a lot of what Mr. Burling is saying is wrong. He states how war will never happen, the Titanic is unsinkable. Obviously 1912, this would indicate to the audience watching in 1945 that a lot of what Mr. Burling is saying is untrue, because we know in hindsight that the Titanic did sink and that the war did take place 2 years later, in 1914. The inspector then obviously arrives with a sharp ring of a doorbell. Edna lets him in, which again is quite important because Edna is quite a minor character, but actually does have quite a significant role in introducing the inspector into the play and into their lives. So when the inspector arrives, he does tell obviously the family that a girl died in the infirmary 2 hours ago, and then this is when the interrogation starts. He has a picture of the girl and a letter and a diary she'd written, and he only ever shows one person the picture at a time. Okay, one line of inquiry at a time is actually what he states. This is important for later on in the play. He reveals the girl's name, and then he shows Mr. Burling the photo first, because Mr. Burling is the first person he interrogates. He then moves on to Sheila, after saying that he mentions Millwoods, and then Sheila obviously realises that they shopped there. And then he moves on and says that after being sacked from Millwoods, Eva Smith changed her name to Daisy Renton. On hearing this, Gerald is shaken, and privately Sheila presses him for more information at the very end of Act 1, and they are the final two on stage in this act, where Gerald then admits he was having an affair with Daisy over the summer, and that was why he didn't see Sheila, and the curtain closes. Act 2. Gerald and Sheila obviously are discussing the affair, and then the inspector tells us that after the affair with Gerald, Daisy went to live by the sea for 2 months. He does make reference to Gerald kind of rescuing her, and Sheila is very sarcastic in the fact that she later on refers to Gerald as the fairy prince. So it's all very much not expected at the time for women to question their husbands. The inspector continues to question people, moving on then to Mrs. Burling, and it is revealed obviously that she is a prominent member of the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation, and she doesn't like the fact that Mrs. Burling was the name used when Daisy Renton went to her for help when she was pregnant. Mrs. Burning then famously claims in this section of the play that it should be the father of the child that should take responsibility. And obviously at this point, Sheila's trying to piece everything together and works out what's happened and begs her mother to stop talking because she is landing herself deeper and deeper in trouble. Eric then enters the scene and Act 2 ends. Act 3, obviously we move on to Mrs. Burling realising what she's done, what she's said, after Eric admits that he was the one who got Daisy pregnant. Like Sheila, he does take responsibility. He's very ashamed of his actions, and it is very much a generation divide. He's very honest about his involvement with Daisy, tells the inspector he drinks heavily, again, which shocks his mother, who often refers to him as just a boy. He did sleep with Daisy, he admits, and on a further evening, when he next met Daisy, he found out that she was pregnant. They both knew they weren't in love and marriage wasn't an option. But Eric then started taking money from his father to help Daisy out, but she refuses to accept the money, and when she found out Eric had taken it, she decides then to end things. The family are distraught, obviously, because they start arguing. They realise that things aren't as perfect as they originally thought, that they're not as straight-laced, and there are some flaws in their family unit. The inspector interrupts this and makes a speech about how if we are not responsible for each other, there will be terrible consequences. It's the fire, blood and anguish speech, where he talks about millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths in this world and how we all need to take responsibility for each other. The inspector then leaves and Gerald returns after leaving after his interrogation, after going for a walk. He meets a police officer when he was on his walk, and found out that there was no Inspector Gall on the force. They then start questioning whether or not any of this is real, whether or not it could have been different girls, suggesting the whole evening could have been a trick. So then Gerald rings the local infirmary and discovers that no girl has died by drinking disinfectant. And Mr. and Mrs. Burling are excited by the idea, along with Gerald, that they may not be to blame after all. However, Eric and Sheila are aware that it makes no difference whether or not the inspector was real. They still behave badly. They still have to accept their actions were true and that they did do what they said they'd done, and they need to realise that and take responsibility. So again, you've got this generation divide between Eric, Sheila, Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Gerald. Just as Mr. Burling is mocking the inspector, though, and is celebrating that he's off the hook, the phone rings. So another stage direction, another structural device, along with the bell ringing at the beginning. Mr. Burling answers the phone, and to his horror, it is the police. They inform him that a girl has just died after drinking disinfectant, and a police officer is on their way to ask the family some questions. The curtain falls and the play ends. Obviously, there is a moral to the story. The whole idea of taking responsibility, socialism being the way forward, the idea that Priestley believed heavily in, the whole notion of looking after each other, society all working together, something that Mr. and Mrs. Burling are against. Have a read of the context, have a little look through. I won't read you every single individual box, but you need to remember that Inspector Calls was written in 1945, just after World War II, but was set in 1912, before World War I and World War II. Think about what happened around this time, have a read of this slide. Why did Priestley write it? What were his intentions? What influenced him, and how had the world changed from 1912 to 1945? I'd like you to watch the video below about the context of an Inspector Calls. And please remember there are two parts, so make sure you do watch one after the other. As you watch the video, I want you to fill in the information in this grid. So again, 1912 is when Inspector Calls was set, before World War I, the year of the Titanic sinking, and it was written in 1945, after World War II. So think, what was life like for the different classes in 1912? Upper classes, working classes, housing, money, quality of life, divide, attitudes. Gender, what was life like for men and women? Jobs, power, careers, role in the home, thinking 1912 versus 1945. And the world generally, the wars, the main events. So think about before World War I and World War II, before the Titanic sunk, before the Germans declared war, okay, and after in 1945, what the audience learn with hindsight, having watched it in 1945 after all these events take place. And finally, your main task now. Okay, so now you've watched everything, you've filled in the grid, you've read and listened to me reading the summary of all the acts. I want you to now think about everything you've learned today. I want you to use this information to answer this question in 100 words. Why did Priestley write an Inspector Calls? Any questions, please let me know on Teams. I'll be obviously available on the chat as always. Good luck with this week's work, and I will see you again next week. Thank you.